I am optimistic that the current tragedy will end, uh, but I don't know that the crisis we're in will be resolved quickly. I just don't know. I think the inevitable collapse of Ukraine will be helpful because it will put all of these people in the position that LBJ and his friends were in 1968. In other words, you lied. This hasn't worked. So that will be helpful. But we've got to get control of our borders. We have to enforce the law. We have to have effective police forces, and we need effective armed forces. Maintaining these illusions, fiction, that, people's gender is fluid, or worse, that it doesn't matter, so that you have women all over the place on the ground in the Army and the Marine Corps where they absolutely should not be in the event of a war. I mean, there are places where women can be employed effectively, where their talents can be put to use, where they're protected. But again, this is back to the problem of understanding what war is really like. Winston Churchill used to say, war is the absence of moral restraint. Well, he was right. War is barbarism. And that's why you want it to end as soon as you can end it, because the longer it lasts, the worse the barbarism becomes. We've forgotten all of that. We see too much on television, this artificial world where Buffy and John and Jim go to war together and everything works out all right, maybe a couple of scratches and one person's killed and that's it. It's a lot of nonsense. War is barbarism and involves killing on the industrial scale. That's what you're seeing happen today. In Ukraine, the Russians have perfected this connection between overhead surveillance, intelligence surveillance, reconnaissance, and strike systems, artillery, rockets, missiles, mortars, everything. And within minutes, they can bring anything in front of them under effective attack to the point where the attacking force will be destroyed long before it ever comes to close with the Russian forces defending on the ground. That's industrial scale warfare, involving huge quantities of munitions. We're not prepared for that. The Russians are, and they're making it work for them. So I think, for instance, right now in Ukraine, all the air defenses are gone for all intents and purposes. So casualties will simply go up because the advances in precision munitions, everything from glide bombs and cruise missiles to conventional artillery that is now accurate and precise, put it all together, concentrate it, and you're killing thousands and thousands of people within a few hours. And that's why this war needs to stop. The Ukrainians can win it, and we have a moral obligation as Americans to intervene and put an end to this and find a way forward. The problem is I don't think we have any credibility with the Russians any longer. I don't think any of the governments in Western Europe do. Now, if the governments in Western Europe change, then there's a possibility something could occur. If the German government and the French governments were to change, then potentially they could negotiate an end to this tragedy with Moscow. But I don't see any possibility that could happen for us in Washington. And I don't know what you think about London, but I don't think much is going to change there immediately. And then, of course, we had this thing called the Minsk Accords, which was, in theory, presented to the Russians as a way to get past the conflict and maintain some measure of civility and peace in Ukraine. Well, it didn't work, and it didn't work, as we've discovered, because first Chancellor Merkel, who's now retired, and then subsequently Mr. Macron, the president of France, both admitted the whole thing was a hoax. It was simply a device to buy time for the Ukrainians to build their forces up. And it became very clear to the Russians that this large force, which is extremely well equipped and I would argue reasonably well trained, certainly by NATO standards, was poised to launch an attack at Russia with the goal of crushing the Russians in Luhansk and Donetsk and then ultimately retaking Crimea. So the Russians said, no, thank you. And they intervened. The big mistake they made is that they assumed that someone was willing to negotiate with them. And so they went in with a really small force, no more than 90,000 on the ground in terms of combat troops. And they discovered after 2 or 3 months, 4 months, even though they were not taking heavy casualties as originally reported, they took very light casualties. It was the Ukrainians that had begun taking heavy casualties almost from the beginning. they discovered that they weren't going to get a negotiated settlement. Finally, the generals met with Putin last summer and said, this is a war. This is not what we bargained for. We miscalculated. The underlying assumptions were wrong. There is no one to talk to. And you'll recall that shortly after your former prime minister's visit in April to Mr. Zelensky, that any hope of talks was crushed. And ultimately, they said, we've got to get ready for a real war. That meant mobilizing reserves, expanding the size of the army, training everybody up, re-equipping people, because the equipment they used initially was almost all obsolescent. So that was completed by Christmas. Then there was pressure to launch an offensive, but the weather didn't cooperate, so the decision was made, since we don't have firm ground, and you recall that in that part of the world, you have this thing called the Rasputitsa, which is effectively a sea of mud that makes it virtually impassable for armored fighting vehicles or wheeled vehicles. If you leave the hard surface road, you're in big trouble. If you go back to World War II, you find that the major offensives were either launched in the dead of winter when the ground was frozen, or they were launched in June, July, August, September timeframe. So the Russians then said, fine, we'll build an impregnable defense, hold what we've got, and invite the Ukrainians to attack us. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians have taken terrible, terrible losses. And these losses have never been truthfully reported in the Western media, because I think Washington was very concerned that if it became clear that the Ukrainians were dying at great numbers, their forces were being destroyed almost faster than they could be fielded, that support for this insane notion of waging a proxy war on the backs of the Ukrainian people against Russia would no longer be supported in NATO. I don't think so. Now, we do have a problem in the United States with this notion of war. We are very similar to Britain before 1914. War was always something that happened on someone else's soil. The result of this is that you develop an inflated view of yourself and your capabilities. You know, if you go back before World War I, certainly before the Boer War, there was this attitude in Great Britain that they were the preeminent power. They were richer than everyone else. They could do pretty much what they wanted. The Boer War certainly changed a lot of people's views of the world, but even then it wasn't enough. It took World War I to really make a dent. And that's been one of my nightmares, that we would stupidly precipitate our involvement in something that could become a world war when there was no reason to, just as I personally believe, as my family did and my ancestors on both sides, that there was no reason for the British to go to war with Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1914. Absolutely none. And I think it did more to destroy the British Empire, which on the whole, I believe was a positive thing, not a negative thing, than anything else undertaken. So I worry that we're embarked on a similar course. But there's good news. Our economy can't keep up. The money printing is right behind us. You cannot substitute that in perpetuity for low productivity. So I think the whole financial lie is going to come home to roost just in time to prevent us from embarking on stupidity overseas. The other thing is that our armed forces are in terrible condition. The army is in no position to fight the Russians. I don't think the British army is either, sadly. And I think everybody in Europe is aware of that privately. So what do you do if you're a globalist and you're losing? This is the question. Do you do something really stupid? And that's what I worry about. Do we suddenly send forces into Western Ukraine once the Russians overrun everything in June, and in an attempt to somehow or another hold back the inevitable, and think that if we do this, this is going to somehow or another impress the Russians? The Russians are not impressed anymore. The Russians, if anything, the Russian people are furious. We should be grateful that Mr. Putin has turned out to be someone capable of exercising restraint. This is not someone who's given to emotion and ruled by emotion, thank God. But here we're ruled a lot by emotion, and that worries me.